So it's this page, and it's the children's rights, which actually were put together first time ever in the history of the world by this incredible person, and only after there came Geneva Declaration in 1924. Amida.
I wrote a book, it's a French book for children about the rights of children. And
Yeah, perfect.
I was shocked because they don't mention at all
Korczak.
Janusz Korczak. Not
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
And it's shocking.
I can tell you, I learned about Korczak in 1991 during the international conference I told you, and before that, the name of Korczak was never known, never pronounced. I, of course, knew about children's rights. Clearly, being an educator, I never heard that Korczak was the founder, so don't be surprised. There are so many incredible people in the world whose names are either forgotten or kind of on the periphery. So let's get back to the rights. So who wants to start? From what side? Secret? You wanted to talk, but that was the last right,
Yes.
yeah? Yeah, but let's start with the beginning, with you, please.
Sure, no problem. The child has the right to love. Love the child, not just your own.
Let's talk about it. Love the child, not just your own. Who has children? Yeah, so, and me. How does it feel? I mean, love all children, not just your own. How does it feel? I mean, does it sound kind of a little too much?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just, my whole life has been dedicated to promoting the well-being of children, and I had my son very late.
Oh, come on, you're young. When you say very late, I feel like I'm 100 years old.
So at 40, I had my son when I was 40. And it allowed me to love in a way I've never experienced before. But I didn't lose the connection or the love I had for all the other amazing children and the children and the adults. That's something that I really like to bring out, and I teach kids yoga trainings for adults, is really loving that we were talking about yesterday, the child in ourselves and not forgetting.
Okay, okay. You wanted to say something, Sigrid?
I think it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
So you can't just love your own child because, I don't know, that seems kind of selfish.
You're a teacher, right?
Yes.
Who else is a teacher, like actively teaching? Okay, so you come to the classroom, there are all sorts of kids. There are always a couple who are incredibly attentive, loving you from the moment you come in, eating you with their eyes, ready always, home assignment, everything. You love this child right away, right? But there are those who you have to discipline, you have troubles with this person. Do you love that student as well?
I always
Yeah.
love those ones more.
Okay, why, Tim?
I don't know, they challenged me. And I don't know where I learned this from, but I learned it very early, that the ones that were difficult, I would get them to, particularly when I worked with little children, I would get them to be my helpers, I would bring them in, and I don't know, there was something about, when they really listened to me, I felt like I earned it.
Okay, okay.
But I don't know where it came from, because I was one of the really good kids, like, so I guess opposites attract.
Okay, Alice.
Yes. So, because I teach really young children, like age 3 to 5, I would say that I love all the children, but like we just experience very different moment with each child. Like for example, if there's a child that need extra attention, that is okay. But then when the child just ran into me and then like his eyes shiny and he hugged me and say he loved me, I do really feel like I love
So
him.
they do ask, yeah?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
because older kids would not ask you, of
Yes.
course. They do ask. Okay, so next right.
Actually,
Yes,
I
Amina,
find that
please.
some teenagers, because I teach in high school, and some teenagers actually, they want hugs. They want to feel loved.
People you don't like, you can respect. But I do understand sometimes that people, like older people or people in authority, will demand respect based on their age or their position, and respect for them means more obedience and subservience than it is respect.
Okay,
It's almost
okay,
like blind respect.
okay, and how would you define respect?
It's an interesting conversation. It depends on the person.
No,
I was
no,
having this
no,
conversation-
there
No, I
should
was
be a
having this
universal definition,
But I
right?
was having this conversation with my nephew,
Uh-huh.
who was being quite rude.
I'm sorry, are you on the internet? Can you check the definition of respect, please? Go ahead.
And I said to him,
Yeah.
like, you need to show people respect at a baseball practice. And he's
Uh-huh.
not listening to the coach. And he's like, well, why should I? He doesn't listen to me. And I said, well, we have to show how we want to be treated
Okay.
sometimes before
Did
the
he
person-
get it from you?
He begrudgingly. He was like, whatever. I think so, but it's not a one-time conversation. It's a conversation you
Sure,
have.
sure.
Because the golden rule used to be treat how you want to be treated.
Exactly,
And now
exactly.
it's treat people how they want to be treated. So you have to do some questioning and some exploring
Okay.
with the person about how do they want to be treated. rather than
Michelle,
just
do you have
saying-
anything to add to this about respect?
I think what comes to mind is when a girl would talk back to me, and I would say, how would you know what I have to say if I don't talk back?
Okay.
And so that's sort of this, the value of another person and their, what they can offer and their worth. I think that that's sort of, it's honoring that everybody has something to contribute. For me, that's sort of how I
Regardless of
conceptualize it.
age, right?
Regardless of anything.
Or position,
Yeah,
or
that we all are
anything.
people of worth and
Yeah.
people that contribute, capable, and that we need to tap into that capacity.
Okay, that's great. What else?
This is what this.
Yeah, Amita, go ahead.
It's dangerous because when you say that we should respect, we should respect how people want to be respected, but some people don't know what respect is, and they never learned it. So, if for them to be ordered around is respect, then they want to be ordered around. So I think it's more than just what people want. It's also what we should be giving.
Okay, Sigrid, got it?
I'm choosing the Cambridge Dictionary.
Okay.
Because
Yeah, of course, the Brits are always right.
the language and the saying. The admiration felt or shown for someone or something that you believe has good ideas or qualities. That's the first one.
That's not what we were talking about,
Yeah, that
right?
will, there's
Okay,
more.
yeah.
Politeness, honor, or care shown towards someone or something that is considered important. A feeling that something is right or important and you should not attempt to change or harm it. The feeling you show when you accept that different customs or cultures are different from your own and behave towards them in a way that would not cause offense.
Okay.
And then the other one is a particular feature or detail, which is a different meaning of.
So what most corresponds with what we were saying?
Importance. To show that the
Yeah.
other person is important.
That whatever, regardless of differences, yeah, we still kind of, we'll listen to it. Doesn't mean we have to accept, right? But we'll listen to it at least, politely.
It's like
Right.
a guard.
Yeah. So, when a teacher says, you must respect me, I'm a teacher, and in many schools, in authoritarian schools especially, that's what it comes, either directly like this or indirectly in the culture of the school. How would you respond as a student?
I would share one of my own experience because I grew up in a different culture.
Yeah.
And then in my culture, Chinese culture, is like we have this natural respect for older people and for teachers.
Alice,
as well.
stop. Natural respect. What does it mean, natural
It's
respect?
just
You are
like-
born with it?
I grew up and then
Yeah,
I kind
that's
of get the message
part of the
from,
culture,
yes,
yeah.
it's part of the culture.
Okay.
My parents never told me to do that, but I kind of just aware of that. So I would say that
okay.
like the respect for teacher and the respect for older people is that they have knowledge, they have wisdom, and then usually most of the time they're really, really helpful. That's why we feel that we need to respect them.
Okay. Did you ever meet old people who are stupid? Excuse my bluntness.
Sometimes.
Yeah. Right? Or ignorant, incredibly, right? Or just rude, or really treat you like dirt because you are younger, or just they think you don't know anything. You still need to respect them because they are elder, or
We still need to like be polite, but then
Polite,
you don't have to
right.
really need to talk to people. If you don't like them, you just avoid them. That's
Okay.
what we do.
Okay. So I sincerely believe that respect should be deserved. And you cannot demand respect without really doing something respectful, if you wish. But as we saw from the definition, it's not exactly the respect Korczak is talking about if to compare with Cambridge's definition of respect, right?
I would also argue a little bit that there are jerks in the world, but
There are.
and some of them can cause like extreme stress to other people. But I think we also need to, and I don't know, to go dig deeper, because they're like this for a reason.
Okay.
I mean, what happened to them? What is their story, right? Because if we don't look at their story sometimes, then we just see the jerk, but we don't see the context of why
That's
they
an
became,
excellent point.
right?
Excellent point.
Because
Yeah.
you could say that grandparents are jerks, but do we really know?
Their
Maybe
life
they went
story.
through
Yeah, yeah.
wars and we just didn't know about it, or like, and you know, they've killed people in wars. They came back.
So
They didn't get.
have a
like,
teacher, right?
Yeah. We just need to, I think, have a little bit also. That's why I think everyone kind of deserves respect. Maybe not the admiration portion of
Yeah.
that definition, but I think everyone does have some sort of value, and just
Okay.
the world and their experiences might have just corrupted their view. Doesn't mean we have to listen to them. Doesn't mean we have to obey them. Doesn't mean we have to admire them. But I think to still give that basic, a basic level of you're a human being. I'm hoping that you weren't born this way,
Okay.
but instead some things happen to you. And I
No,
don't know what it
that's
is.
an excellent point.
Yeah.
We just need to go further,
Yeah.
but we will keep talking about respect for sure.
Yeah.
So who's next?
I
Amita.
just want to add something.
Yeah.
Maya Angelou actually said at one point, I did what I did and I did better when I knew better. And I think that's how life is and how we are.
Like I was ignorant and I
Yeah.
didn't know, and
And
now I know,
yeah.
and I'm doing
sometimes
better.
we have
Okay.
to learn and we have to teach also.
Okay, okay. Bronwyn, next. Yeah.
The child has the right to optimal conditions in which to grow and develop. We demand do away with hunger, cold, dampness, stench, overcrowding, and overpopulation.
So, yeah, practically nothing to discuss, right? Just quiz. Next one, Sabrina.
A child has the right to live in the present. Children are not people of tomorrow, they are people of today.
We spoke about it, right? Amita, next,
The
please.
child has the right to be himself or herself. A child is not a lottery ticket marked to win the main prize.
Okay, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I see that a lot because at school I have parents who decide for their kids what they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be taking, which classes and which university and which career, and actually they are projecting themselves into the kids and they
Okay.
are not checking with the kid. What do you want?
Okay, okay.
I think in our social pediatrics program, we work with children who, you know, they have limited opportunities and
Yeah.
they're struggling with these basic needs, you know, food security, housing, those kinds of things. And how we approach things is to look at children and their gifts. And, you know, what are their individual gifts and how can
And
we
each
foster
has
those?
it, right? Only some children have
Every
it on the
child has
surface and some have deeper inside. You have to dig deeper to find it. That's a
Absolutely.
great idea, to look for a gift in a child. Yeah, next one.
Yes. So the child has the right to make mistakes. There are no more fools among children than among adults.
Who wants to talk about that?
I think there are more fools with adults than personal opinion.
Why?
Hmm.
I agree with that. Why?
Because I think sometimes adults put a lot of rules and restrictions on themselves that are artificial, and they try to impose that on other people. I don't know.
Okay.
That's kind
Okay.
of, they just have things that they think should happen that aren't really.
Okay. Michelle, next slide, please.
The child has the right to fail. We renounce the deceptive longing for perfect children.
How about that? Do you want to say something about that, Michelle?
I think the idea of perfection in itself is a fallacy, and so the expectation that a child would ever be anything that embodies what I think our societal notions of perfection is.
Okay. The next one, who wants to read? Who didn't read? Claire.
I haven't read it.
Yeah.
The child has a right to be taken seriously. Who asked the child for his opinion and consent?
Okay.
So that, children have value in what they have to say and what they think and their perspectives on things. They help us see things in different ways.
Right. Right. Okay. Jane, the next one, please.
Could I just,
Yeah,
could I just say something? That's a really important issue, and I remember a little girl of 8. This was in a conference with children. We were in the lift together, just the two of us, and she was at the conference that was organised. And she said, "This is the very first time that adults have listened to me." So taking children seriously is, especially for smaller children. Even with teenagers, of course, but with smaller children, actually adults simply just seriously listening and taking what they have to say seriously is quite an unusual, surprising thing for children and for adults as well.
Yeah.
Giving them a voice.
Jane.
Can I just add something?
Sure.
There was an amazing drama teacher in the north of England whom I met in the 1970s. Her name is Dorothy Heathcote, and she pioneered a way of doing drama with children. Do you know about her? Where she wouldn't stand out here and have the kids act there. She would enter into the plays with them, but she always played the person who was the stupidest in the group. Like she turned the children into experts. And it was the same thing that you're talking about. It was absolutely transformative to watch how, the children would turn to her expecting that she would have all the answers, but she in character would play somebody who was just completely incompetent. And so they would come up with the most, and she would go in and work in schools that were, in very underprivileged areas. And I think,
That's excellent.
that she was completely in heart. I don't know that she ever knew about Korczak, but they're
Probably
often
not,
brought the two of them
but it's
together.
along the
Yeah.
same lines.
Yeah.
I know a teacher who couldn't find a way to deal with 2 kids at 7th grade, just never disciplined, always not prepared. She didn't know what to do. And finally, kind of the situation helped her. She went with the kids together for skiing. And she was not a good skier. But these two happened to be great. And all of a sudden, she is in the position that she needed help. And these two, first time ever, felt they were better than the teacher. But they were not only better, they were much more generous. As kids are, usually, right? So they came up to her and it was going down the slope and she was very afraid, which I can easily relate to. And they said, "Oh, don't you worry, we will be on both sides, we will help you." And she went down with them on both sides, helping her. And when they were down, she said, "Oh, thank you so much, you saved my life." From that day on, no problems. So she gave them, she provided that sense of respect for themselves.
Kids are not born jerks.
Of course not, of course not.
So then,
No one
So the
is, right?
Yeah, so the question of respect and elder people, they become somehow, sometime jerks.
But because adults have a longer period to develop into jerks, the situation that they might become jerks is much less problematic than children being jerks. Would you agree with that? A little complicated phrase. But, okay, next, please. Who didn't read yet? Jane.
The child has the right to be appreciated for what he is. The child, being small, has little market value.
Can you name just one feature for which you would appreciate a 5-year-old kid, regardless, yours or whoever?
Their honesty.
Honesty. Who else?
They're genuine.
Sorry,
They're genuine.
genuine.
They tell you they love you, no matter what.
Okay,
Creative.
Sabrina.
They're very forgiving.
Forgiving, yeah.
Imaginative.
Okay, creative, yeah? Yeah.
They're fun.
Fun,
Yeah.
yeah? Judith, anything left?
Compassionate.
Compassion. Michelle?
Open-minded.
Perfect.
They're very fast learner.
Fast learners. Okay, 55 adult. Give me some features.
Wisdom.
Wisdom, okay, Michelle. Who?
Experience.
Experience,
Maturity, hopefully.
maturity, hopefully. Okay.
Financial stability.
Okay, hopefully. Okay. What
We
else?
had the opportunity to make lots of mistakes and learn from them.
Okay. As you see, we're lacking qualities. It was much easier to say something good about children. Did you notice that? Something to think about. The next, please, Sabrina.
The child has the right to desire, to claim, to ask. As the years pass, the gap between adult demands and children's desires becomes progressively wider.
Okay. Who wants to comment on this? Oh, it's clear. Yeah, okay, next. Bronwyn.
The child has the right to have secrets, respect their secrets.
Please, I want to hear about that. Do you?
They have a right to
About
privacy.
secrets. Because parents say, what are you doing? What are you hiding from me? You have to be open. Did you have secrets, secret places where you put a small stone, a broken glass, a piece of cloth when you were a child? And you cherished it, right? It was like the most precious belonging you had. How do you feel about this? The children have the right to have secrets. Yes.
Like I always tell children that there are like good secret and there are bad secret. If
Okay.
somebody hurt you, you have to tell. Because like
Okay.
I don't want if somebody tell the child, oh you can never tell your teacher, you can never tell your parents. But in this case, you have to tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Claire?
I have a little nephew, and he's almost 4 now, but when he was even just really little, like 2, I take him overnight, and there was this time that he had, he just wanted to be alone, and he had this way of communicating, and it was kind of amazing, like emotional regulation at such a young age, and I left him alone, but I would check on him, and he was just sitting in there giggling with his Elmo, and I thought how magical it was for him to be in his secret little world, and I just
At 2.
respected that. At 2, yeah. It was amazing.
Okay.
It's privacy.
Exactly.
Like my son likes to have, he has his own little place to retreat to. It's like a little fort, and he likes to go in there and spend time by himself and do his own thing.
And children in principle love to make tents out of sheets and get into the dark there, crawl and be there. Why? They need their own privacy.
Space, yeah, and he's 20 months, so,
Yeah.
you know, and they can, if you're open to it, they communicate that. But that's where he tries out new things.
Yeah.
So I hear him talking to himself and trying out new words I haven't heard say before, or he's doing new things. So he just needs that place for himself.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
the place.
I think, but here he says that the right to a lie, a deception, a theft, but not to lie, to deceive. To
Exactly.
steal,
Exactly.
Which is different.
Yeah. Yeah, how do you understand this?
Well, the
Amita?
way I see it is like, it shouldn't be a habit of lying
Sure.
and deceiving, but sometimes you do need that, what we call the white lie, because
Yeah. Can you bring situations, examples of white lies?
Well, if you don't want to hurt people's feeling, then
Yeah.
people ask you, oh, how do I look? You say,
Mhm.
oh, it's really nice.
Okay.
You don't tell them, oh, this dress is so ugly, it's not nice.
Okay, okay. Did you have situations when you would say this to your friend or to somebody who is close to you, and the person goes out and you know it's ugly, and you were thinking to yourself, I should have told the truth. Have you been in a situation like that?
I've been in the one wearing the ugly outfit and been like, why didn't you tell me?
Okay.
Please be honest.
Okay.
I think though it is important, and I'm, this is a different time, so he probably doesn't necessarily know this, because he's saying like from what I understand, the occasional,
Yeah.
not to develop it as
Yes. As a
character
habit.
trait,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But to know that sometimes, especially when kids get to 4 or 5, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're going to tell some whoppers, like things that actually can have huge consequences for adults. And it's not out of being terrible people. It's really testing this idea. Well, if I say something really, really
Mhm.
not true, are they going to know?
Mhm.
Right? It's just, again, testing this idea. Can they read my mind, or do they think differently?
And there's one more thing. There's rich imagination.
Yes.
Children quite often live in their own world of different characters, different people around, different country within themselves. They create all this, and they're not really lying. They're just telling you the world which you're not aware of. Right? Okay, next one. Please, Claire.
The child has the right to respect for his possessions and budget. Everyone has the right to his property, no matter how insignificant or valueless.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what you would say about that, because parents would say, you never earned a penny in your life.
But I think it's a bit about context as well, because when I was working in Northern Reserves, I'm not going into somebody's house and saying, you have a right to this, this, and this, and this, so that they are then aware of what they don't have, rather that they're valuing what they do have. So I would be careful around, you have a right to, have your food and your shelter and these kinds of things, and if you're not getting them, the adults have a responsibility to help you.
Here's the situation. You are 5 years old, your birthday party, your parents invite lots of your friends and their friends, and some of their friends bring you a beautiful doll, beautiful. And when they leave the party, the mother says, you know what, it's so precious and so expensive, I better put it somewhere up there, and we will just look at it. And the girl says, it's mine, they gave it to me, and the mother says, yes, but it's expensive, I'm not sure you will be careful with it. What would you say? First of all, is it real, this situation? Can you imagine this?
Yeah.
Can you relate to this? So what would you say as a child?
Oh, as a child. Okay.
Yeah, how would you feel as a 5-year-old?
Injustice.
You got this
It's mine, it's my
incredible doll, and it's so beautiful.
It's an injustice, the feeling of not being respected.
Yeah, I'm not sure the child would use the word justice or injustice.
It
Yeah.
means
It's not
for
fair.
sure.
It's not fair. Yeah, it's not fair. What else? What would the child say to the mother? And it might bring a huge, storm of emotions on the mother's part.
It's mine, it's not yours. It's mine to do what I want with.
Yeah, okay. What else? I think the best is it's not fair, right? It's not fair. I think that's what the child would say, because fair, unfair, that's what children learn early enough. But can it happen? What is the reasoning of the mother in this situation? Can you relate to the mother's
The reasoning
behavior?
of the mother is if this child breaks, if the doll gets broken, then my friend who gave the doll to my child will be upset.
Would be upset.
And it becomes about the adults and not about the children.
Right,
And,
okay.
you know, as opposed to maybe having a conversation with the child about, you know, what could happen and seeing what the child decides. But, I mean, I think that's what we do all the time.
But then the child doesn't learn how to take care of their own belongings.
No, I
either.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's talking about
Yeah, but
mother's
where the
reasoning,
mother
yeah.
goes, or where the adult goes,
Yeah.
is about other adults, and that's what he's talking about.
So Jonathan Levy is not only a wonderful specialist in how to work with children, but he's also one of the people who exemplifies this whole Korczak's ideology, if you wish, how to work with children, remaining a child yourself. And because of it, he managed to do what he managed to do, managing in the present time. And the rest he will tell you. He is also vice president of the International Korczak Association, which has about, 30 countries, I believe?
About.
Yeah, so he's an official in a way, but in many other ways, he's definitely a great, very talented educator. So I think we're all lucky to have him here. And without further ado.
Thank you. Well, that's a lot to live up to. Thank you very much, Tatiana.
Sure,
Thank you.
sure.
So I'm really, really happy and honoured to be here in this wonderful campus and at UBC and to be with you. I'm very grateful to Jerry and to Tatiana to invite me to do this. What I'm going to suggest we do is we're going to work in kind of 4 stages over today and tomorrow. So what I've planned is my sessions are all linked together. They're not kind of separate bits and pieces. They're part of a story. Because I believe that stories, you know, we all grew up learning through stories, and stories are probably one of our most basic pedagogical tools. And what I'm going to suggest is that we start off, first of all, to look about, I'm going to follow from Tatiana, who's done this great groundwork with you of understanding Korczak and understanding the rights, which we've done this morning. And I'm going to follow on from there to what are the conditions which bring those alive for children? Because it's not because we tell them that they've got rights or that we demonstrate they have rights. There are certain conditions which need to be put into place to make that happen. And there's an incredible gap with a lot of children's lives between the discourse, the narrative around rights, and the reality, the everyday reality. And the model that has been given to us by Korczak is a living model where he actually put them into practice. And it's from that inspiration that we need to bring that to an actualization of today, of how that can happen with today's children, because we're no longer in the 1920s or the 1930s. So how can we bring them alive today in our context? So in order to do that, what I suggest is this morning, I'd like to just explain some of those basic conditions from my own experience and to discuss those with you. And this afternoon, I'm proposing we'll do a practical workshop where we will kind of simulate how those conditions can come about, okay, so that we can practice those. And at the end of the day, with Tatiana, we'll look at the practical implications and discuss those and debrief.
Jonathan, if I may interfere, and we will have maybe additionally half an hour before the discussion, because we still have the history of human rights, of children's rights, which you have as papers there in the folder, which we never went through. So we will do that, but briefly.
Okay, good. And tomorrow, we'll have children. You know, that's a missing element in the story and an important one. So you'll actually work with the children, and the children will work with you in a very kind of special context.
I didn't tell them about it. So we will have students from U Hill Secondary School, which is here on campus. We will have 8 high school students
8,
who
yeah.
will come, and we will have a workshop together with them. So for you to be surprised how brilliant kids could be.
So we're going to go into, you know, a real practical application of this. And it's going to be really based on, and then we'll end up with Tatiana debriefing that experience, but the children will be with us and they'll be debriefing you and you'll be debriefing them, and we'll try and capture some of the learnings from that experience. Yeah. So does that sound okay for you? Good, because I don't have a plan B, yeah? So I'm quite happy you're happy with that. So the title of this Summer Institute is wonderful. It's wonderful for me anyway, but I think it's a wonderful choice of title because it's Child Advocacy in Action. And that's really what we need to do. That's what practically the whole of my work is involved in, how to enable, to empower, to and help adults to unlearn in that mix, to give children the possibility that they have their major role in transforming society. In other words, we can't transform or make society better without children, which represent, let's face it, 1/3 of the world population. And in some of the countries, in Africa, in Asia, it can go up to 60% of the population. So we can't possibly find the right solutions to the woes of the world, the problems of the world, without children. It's just unfeasible, and yet we do that all the time. So children's participation is at the base of child advocacy. So what is the problem of child participation? So what we're really talking about is children as rights holders, not just as adults as rights givers to children. You know, that's not what we were talking about, and certainly not what Tatiana was explaining, how children have rights. So in order to have rights, they have to be rights holders, and therefore participation is the basis of every human right, including children's rights. So globally, we were at a critical junction with growing environmental, economical, and political challenges. Working in partnership with children and young people is essential if we are to find the solutions to these challenges and create more just, sustainable, inclusive, and equitable societies. We can't possibly do it without them. So it's not just a great idea for children to participate, but it's actually vital and it's essential, and from their youngest age. And it's not just a legal issue, but what's very interesting is that it goes from the individual and their well-being, because we know that contribution and receiving and being able to give and to be able to receive what that contribution is has an incredible effect on self-esteem. And we know that self-esteem builds into self-confidence, and we know that without it, a lot of the problems of the world start to happen. So it goes from the individual's well-being to the society's well-being, and in the intermediate, the well-being of institutions like schools, like families, like hospitals, like other organizations that we all need. So it works on every level of society, is a necessary fundamental issue. So participation is the building block of democracy. Globally, it is the means to create active citizens and thriving civil societies, the foundations for dynamic communities and economies, and to hold governments to account, and when necessary, challenge corruption and undemocratic practices. So that's the fundamental basis of why participation is so important. And it's not by magic at the age of 18 that we suddenly become democrats. in our thinking, in our style. It's a learning process from the very beginning. So part of what I think is really important, and it generally tends to be the missing part, is what are the conditions which enable that to happen? In France, in my backyard, politicians tend to be very pleased by proposing new types of opportunities for children to participate. But the problem is, because they don't put into place the conditions, or the professionals that are dealing with them haven't been trained in how to think in this way, then they simply are inviting children to participate. The children don't know how to participate, and the adults end up manipulating them in these situations, and it becomes the absolute opposite of participation. So it's not just a question of creating new opportunities like children's councils or children's parliaments or whatever, and then expecting everything to happen without actually studying what those conditions are. And that's really it's more the how-to than the why or the what that is generally the problem. But on the other hand, we have this very bizarre thing happening in education, probably globally, where we start to discuss tools for some strange reason. We start to say, this thing is not working, this thing's great, this works with my students, that's not working, blah, blah, blah. And it's almost like that we're putting everything onto these sort of methods and techniques, you know. And that's why Korczak is really interesting, because he wasn't that interested in methods. He basically said that what worked today probably won't work tomorrow, because children change, and they're not necessarily the same children, or even if they're the same children, they're not in the same mood, you know. So, you know, blaming things or saying this tool doesn't work and that, you know, it's like giving me a very expensive electric guitar like a Gibson Les Paul or a Fender Stratocaster and expecting me to play like Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton. You know, you'd be really disappointed. So, you know, it starts with us, and it starts with what Korczak really gave us, which is a way of thinking of children and a whole philosophy of childhood and education. And it's that philosophy which is really important, because Korczak was part of an amazing generation of educationalists, of thinkers, that came into being, if you like, into their being between those two horrible wars in the 20s and the 30s. And there's a whole group of them, as you know, that did amazing things and argued for democracy, for freedom, for critical thinking of children, and particularly in the aftermath of the horrible First World War, where the whole population were ready to put into question the authoritarian system of education where you had to follow rules and regulations. And they realized that, you know, they wanted children to have a better future and to think for themselves. So actually, although those pedagogues didn't have much joy at the end of the 19th century, they had a very good audience, I would say, in a lot of places in the world because of the horror of that war. But at the same time, of that freedom of thinking and that wonderful period of experimentation which happened all over the world, you know, in lots of places, in India, in Japan, in Latin America, probably here as well, and you had John Dewey in America, and you had all these people all over the world. You know, you had a contrast of the rise of fascism in Europe at the same time as these. And it's very interesting that the actual dictators, the fascist leaders, were very excited as well about these pedagogues. Mussolini thought Montessori was wonderful. And he flattered her and he said he would put Montessori schools all over Italy. What he took was the method. What he didn't take was the philosophy. And if you think about the Hitlerian youth movement, Scoutism, you know, and many of the other methods that were being used for the good of humanity were diverted towards the ends of control and fascism. So it's not the methods themselves, it's the thinking and the regard to the child and the philosophy behind it that we have to take into account. So the problem is that the convention is a wonderful, and we're in this 30th year, as Jerry announced yesterday. It's the political and legal discourse, but it's the gap of that, taking it away from that conceptual framework and making it come alive in the home, in the classroom, in the play area, in the hospital, wherever children gather. So we know that one of the ways to look at it, and this is part of what I'd like to work with you this afternoon on, is that one of the ways we can look at the convention is its systemic vision, that the rights are interlocked together, and if we violate one of the rights, then the others don't work. And Korczak knew this in the orphanage, that if we don't respect the right to identity, then you know that person's not known, is not understood, then he doesn't have the right to other things. And this happens, you know, in the world. There are phantom children that don't have any birth certificate, they don't have any papers, and they don't have the right as a result to education, to health, or in difficult circumstances. So that's one way to look at it, is the systemic aspect to it. And unfortunately, although we've intellectually understood that systemic view of rights, that they're not like a shopping list, that I want that one but I don't like that one, you have to take the whole package. Unfortunately, what we've done in our separatist, particularly Western world, is we've separated them and we've created specialized professions that are dealing with different aspects of it. So this doesn't help in a way of providing for the child a global, holistic experience of their rights. We've actually even created jargon which is to do with protection of children. We've created jargon which is to do with provision for children and so on. And what we need to do, if we're going to build it together, is to make that all come together. And that's what I propose that we do. Does that make sense? So, working on the 3 Ps. Does anybody know what the 3 Ps are in children's rights? No? That's good. It means I'm not going to bore you too much. The 3 Ps. So we can regroup all the different rights in the convention under 3 Ps. So the first P is provision. So there's a whole set of rights in the convention which says that we need to provide to children. This means that the member states that have ratified that convention should provide children with a multitude of varied situations, contexts and institutions which need to be provided for children. For all of the children to be well, they need health, they need education, they need early childhood opportunities and institutions. They need a warm bed, they need good food, they need a family. They need a lot of things which governments and decision makers need to provide to them, both locally, nationally, internationally. So provision is a fundamental aspect of children's rights, and there are many articles in the convention which stipulate that children need to have those provision. It also says in the convention that children, and this is what Korczak...
I'm sorry to interrupt. You have the full text of the convention in your folder. You can bring it up and maybe follow, because they have the full text.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the convention also tells us that we need to not just provide schools and hospitals and leisure areas and play areas, but they need to be of a certain quality, and they need to be the best quality we can provide. It doesn't tell us what that quality is. It leaves us up to us to provide that quality. But it's not enough to say that we've got a school and children are going to be shouted at or beaten up when they go to school. That's not what it's about. It's not just access to education, but it's access to quality education. So we've got provision. The second P is protection. Because of the age of the child, children need to be protected. So they need to be protected, and there's a whole series of rights on this, that children have to be protected from all forms of abuse, neglect, exploitation and discrimination. This is the right to safe places for children to play, etc. Now, what's interesting about Korczak is that he saw protection as a liberating force, it's not simply don't touch this, don't go there, that's dangerous. It's not that thinking about protection. It's more to do with creating a safe environment where children feel liberated, free, in order to participate. So we'll look at that connection between those two. And of course, one of the big problems is that we can either, with protection, it's like on a scale, we can go to an extreme where we overprotect children. And where I come from in early childhood, because I train early childhood professional students, we've created an overprotected environment, particularly in the creche and institutions, where as soon as a child is dirty, you've got to clean them, and they're not allowed to make a chocolate cake because they might poison someone, and they're not allowed to play with sand. You know, we've gone to incredible extremes where children have got adults that are so present that they haven't got a chance to even experiment with things. We'll come back to that. So that's one extreme. The other extreme, of course, is where we underprotect children and they feel in danger. So that doesn't help children feeling safe in order to participate. So it's finding a balance, and I think Korczak experimented with that. There's no fixed point on that scale. It's different with each child, with each adult, with each context, but it's actually being conscious of finding the right balance. And if we look at protection, just to give you some examples, even after 30 years, we've still got problems. This is female genital mutilation, and you can see this is in percentage form, that just one issue, you know, of the girl child, that this horror still exists. Even though it's outlawed in every country, in a clandestine way, these horrors are still existing, and we're still mutilating young girls and women. And this is just one example of how the non-respect of the convention is still happening, and culture, of course, is not sacred and needs to be challenged in these areas. Another example is child marriage. This is India, which has one of the highest rates of child marriage. So you see in one of the states, Bihar, 68% of children underage are being forced into arranged marriage. So again, and this of course destroys childhood. A lot of the girls are pregnant by the age of 13, 14 or whatever. So again, the work is still not being done. We can all congratulate ourselves for 30 years of the convention, but we have to also take into account that when we blow out the candles, there's going to be candles still alight. They don't go out yet because the work has still got to be done. And of course we can go into many other examples of this, but protection is still a huge issue for many, many children around the world. And the final P, is participation. So participation was really the big contribution that Korczak gave, because Eglantine Jebb in 1924 proposed, you know, this treaty on children's rights, but Korczak felt that it wasn't enough, it wasn't radical enough, and it didn't include participation. And participation was the big thing. So Article 12 to 15 is really about the right to express, the right to choose, the right to, in certain cases to make decisions, the right to your own beliefs and so on, the right to create associations or to be part of certain governance situations. All these rights are fundamental, because without them, then children are not rights holders. This is the key thing. as right holders. So what we can look at is this. How do we bring these 3 Ps into a systemic framework? Well, we can look at it in this way. That if we want children to fully participate, we need to look at what is a protective environment. How does protection enable participation? So we've created judges, social workers, psychologists that are there to help us with protection. We've created decision makers, politicians that hold big budgets that should be using it to provide for children. And we have educators, NGOs, and they're talking a lot about participation. But they're not necessarily all working together, and the child is in the middle of this story. So what I believe we need to do is to create an environment, whether it be the home, whether it be the school, or whether it be the whole society, where these 3 Ps really interact and work together. So that what we're talking about is the key thing is participation. In order for participation to happen, we have to study how do children feel safe? What are the conditions which they feel protected and enabled, and they don't feel intimidated or humiliated, but they feel empowered. And it works the other way around. Children are not participating to participate. It's not a game. So children can participate with adults to create better protection. So whatever their situation, whether it be in a war situation or whether it just be in a normal happy home, it doesn't matter. What's important is that they can participate to develop a better environment in their situation and in the world. So that's important. And it works the same way with provision. Children will fully participate, can fully participate, if they're provided with the right tools, with the right environment, with the right space, with the right activities, and the right people. In other words, people that are trained, people that understand, people that, as you said before, take them seriously. You know, all those conditions are necessary for it to work. But participation is also to provide better provision. And children can work with adults to create better provision. You know, if someone said to me, I'm 63, so if someone said to me, you know, Jonathan, could you create a play area for children? Well, my first reaction would to say, well, I need to talk to some 9-year-olds and 8-year-olds or whatever, because I no longer look at life as an 8-year-old, you know, and what I used to think was a great place to play is probably not that wonderful anymore, you know. I have no idea. But anyway, it would be more intelligent and it would be obvious that I'd have to work with children in order to create the best provision possible. And yet we don't do that. Isn't that strange? It's almost like if I were to make a parallel with women's rights, it would be like, is it Siegfried? Siegfried and I decided to do a whole conference on women's rights, but we decided not to invite any women, and we're just going to talk about women's rights. And we'll probably end up talking rubbish, you know, because it just doesn't make sense. Yes? So.
Yeah, and definitely women are so different. I'm thinking I would never admit how old I am just in front of
Well, there we go. Yeah. We've established a difference. So, so what this is coming to is it's a whole issue of what we might call transformative learning. So as opposed to conformist learning, it's not learning to fit into a society. I mean, if society was wonderful, then why not? But it's not reproducing what society is, but it's transforming it in a positive way. So we need children to be critical, we need children to question, we need children to participate actively to make and improve a better society. Which led to what I called originally CATS, which was Children as Actors for Transforming Society, which is a program that we've created where children and adults, I felt that what was missing was not the blah blah as I'm doing now, but the actual living experience. And what people were agreeing with me and other people that were saying the same sort of things. That's not the problem. The problem is actually, how do you do it? And I realized what we needed was a laboratory where adults and children can come together to really experiment. So what we did is, each year we brought about 50 nationalities from around the world, from all the different continents, of children and adults coming in delegations from NGOs, from schools, from social settings, from care settings, and to come together, about 300 people, 150 adults, 150 children. There might have been 149 and 151, so you'll excuse me, but more or less half and half. And it's always co-designed the year before by a group of children and adults that co-deliver together a 7-day residential experience. I don't call it a conference. It's a kind of forum through workshops, group work and plenary work that we all come together and we design something where we are empowered of living children's participation in a situation and then taking that experience back into the field. Well, I couldn't do it by myself, so I got together with a group of NGOs, and we're backed by UNICEF and Save the Children, World Vision, so we're getting backing from the big NGOs to some extent, and also smaller ones as well. Sorry?
Where does it take place?
Well, it was in Switzerland. Now, this year in July, we're doing it in France for the first time. World one. And in February, we decided to regionalize it. Well, 2 years ago, we decided to regionalize it. So I decided to take it to India. And we started to do this. Now it's called Child Rights in Action. And we did the first one in February this year in India. And it was co-designed. It took us 18 months, but it was co-designed by children from slum areas in Mumbai and Delhi and Kolkata. We got together with NGOs, Caritas and World Vision and some other NGOs, national NGOs, and we co-designed the thing together. And basically the whole contents was the children, and we as adults worked with them to develop the process with them. But it wasn't us telling them this is the subject. They would come in and say, well listen, I live in a slum in Mumbai and we have no toilets. So this is a big issue and a big problem of dignity of children and their rights. So they were bringing in their experiences and their problems, and we designed around them. So it's based on the idea of what we call transformative pedagogy, which comes together with 4 conditions to make this come alive. One is it has to be experiential. We have to make this into something which we're actually living, and it's not simply intellectual, cognitive, but it has to be emotional, it has to be physical, it has to take into account the whole environment, it has to be spatial. So it's a global experience. Secondly, it's a laboratory, not just for children, but for adults. When I say children, we start at 3 years old. And it's a challenge. What do you do? How do you make things exciting, interesting, and learning when you've got from 3 to 80 in the same room? And that's the educational challenge. And we have 300 people, okay? Some of them are 3, some of them are 5, and it goes up. And we don't call plenary sessions, we call them together times. It's no good making speeches. So we had to design interactive activities with 300 people to make it significant, as much for the adults as children. And I would say that adults actually learn maybe a little bit more than the children do, because they learn to listen. We do what we call community groups, where we split the whole of those 300 people into groups, and they meet each day, and they're a mix of children and adults. And they start to learn how to listen to children, everything that we're talking about, how to take them seriously. And we do workshops, which are kind of capacity building moments. We do different things during the day. And so it becomes like a laboratory. It's never perfect. It's not looking, and I don't think Korczak looked at perfection. He saw it as a laboratory, and we learn every day, And when he was in his earlier days, went to the summer camps, he talks about how much he learned, how the mistakes he made, and how he learned from the children to understand the situation. And it needs to have a coherent storyline. So we build a story each day, and we build it throughout the week. So in the Indian experience, it wasn't just India, we brought in other countries from Asia, from what we call the SAARC countries, which are the countries around India, but it was based in India. The children chose a title, which is called Safe and Sound. So that was our storyline, that was our theme, and it was an umbrella theme. But the baseline of that was, and this is what the children came up with, safe and sound, because a safe world for children, because a safe world for children is a sound world for all. And that was the thinking behind it. And through that, we came up with a metaphor of a bell. And the idea with the bell was the children's voice. And each day we rung the bell louder, so the children's voice could be... And we ended up going to this little town next to where we were working to do a call for action. But we built up a story throughout the day, so it's not like a patchwork of different bits and pieces. And one of the problems for children find in schools, particularly mostly in secondary education, is this patchwork where they go from chemistry to geography to history and trying to understand the connections, or there's no connections, and it's difficult for them to make sense. So it's important that although we do very different types of things, that there is linkages to make this coherent story. So the last element is created varied activities, which create... One of the big problems we have in education today, I would say globally, is attention, is concentration. We're constantly reducing the time we concentrate. So we need to vary and make a dynamic day where we're doing very different kind of things in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and so on. So these are the things. So it's a laboratory of child participation. It's not child participation, and Korczak understood this very well. It is not just about children. It's about children and adults working together. And it's understanding and capacity building, forums, training, transforming from personal empowerment to institutional change to societal and cultural shift of understanding children. So we need to build a chain of individual, in a Gandhian way, in terms of Gandhi, if you want to change the world, you've got to change yourself. This is basically the message he gave us. And I think it's starting with ourselves to change ourselves in order to change society. And deal with the issues really facing children, and not what we think are important, but what the children important is, whether it be abuse, mistreatment, lack of recognition and status, freedom of decision making and life choices are the issues mainly that children tell us that they're dealing with. Oh, I don't know why that's happening, sorry. So the approach is this. It's a collaboration between children and adults with children's rights and this transformative pedagogy, and actually putting into place this interactive element of protection, provision and participation. So these are the three levels that have an impact on the children that we're dealing with. So it's about empowerment. So it's empowerment within. So it's recognition of the right to be heard, believing one's ability to succeed, self-confidence, dignity and self-worth, and it's a power with. So it's coming together to learn from each other. So when we have 50 nationalities that don't speak the same language, children are incredible. Adults have problems, but children find a way of dealing with each other. But it's empower with building partnerships, collaboration, mutual support, valuing common strengths and experiences. And it's an empower to, from a societal point of view, fulfill dreams and aspirations, challenge violations, participate in decisions, influence policy and legislation, claim rights, and hold duty bearers to account. So we had MEPs, that's members of the European Parliament, come to our event. We had decision makers, we had ministers, we had top people from UNICEF, etc., coming and really participating. We didn't want them to come to speak. One or two we had to let them speak, but they came to participate. And we said, the condition is you don't come along, make a speech and say, thank you very much, wonderful what you're doing, and go away. No, 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 no. You stay for the whole week. And we got them. We got people from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. We got all sorts of different people coming, and they stayed. And what they got out of it was very valuable for them. But as a result of that, people from, for example, the European Parliament invited some of those children to come and train some of the parliamentarians in how to speak to children. So it does have a knock-on effect. It's sometimes difficult to get them to understand, but that's what we need to do. We can't constantly blame decision makers that they're not making the right decisions if we don't help them to understand, and that's what we need to do. This is the one that we did in India. And this is our symbol, the little girl with the bell. So I'm just going to end on, maybe discuss this with you here, is that children's participation, one of the problems is power in the mix of participation. Who holds the power and what is the power sharing like? And this is one of the problems. If we take the school environment, one of the problems is that when the adult has all the power and the children has very little or none, then that creates a feeling of what Tatiana was talking about. It's not fair. It's not just. I'm not even part of this story. Yeah? And that non-justice, not even being able to say that the rules are fair, leads to a lack of motivation for learning. We have a big dropout situation. And because we're not learning, then we start to create a feeling of self-esteem because we know we're failing within the institutional framework of the school, a lack of empowerment and self-esteem, and it ends up as an antagonistic relationship between the adult and the child. So the adult ends up, I'm talking about the teacher, ends up having to kind of fight with the child to get them to do the thing that they think is important. And then parents can also add on that to say, look what you're doing, you're making a mess of your life, you're going to end up on the street, blah, blah, blah. And it ends up as this bad antagonistic relationship. So reversing the process. What I'm saying is, if we can understand that taking that first step, which is very frightening for a lot of professionals, of sharing some of the power. I'm not saying it has to be 50-50, but it's giving some of that power to the child so that they can actually contribute and co-create together some things. If the child can contribute, then there is a higher level of a chance of justice, of fairness. And if that contribution is accepted, then we start to want to learn, because in order to contribute, we have to learn things. And then our self-esteem rises, because if what we're contributing is accepted and people are grateful for what we're contributing, then we start to have self-esteem, that what I'm giving, what I'm saying is worth something. And then we start to build a relationship of complicity and not antagonism. Within that leads to a larger knock-on effect in the community and institutions and in society. So I believe that participation is at the heart. It's not just a legalistic demand from the convention, but it's actually for our own health reasons that we grow up with the possibility of actually being self-worth in our development, self-esteem. So this is an interesting image of what not to do. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but it says the Global Summit of Women 2014. So, but you know, it's absurd, right? Guys, you know, middle-aged guys with wearing suits and ties on the stage, and there's a woman down here taking a photograph of them, you know. But but we do that all the time with children. You know, we talk about children, we work with children, but we don't invite them. You know, and how can they do a global summit of women with no women there? You know, it's a So the conditions, if you like, is not this one. We can't oblige, force or manipulate children to participate. It has to be a co-production, and we have to, you know, where sometimes we get it wrong in participation is we as adults in a kind of a well-meaning way, we say there's a great project, you should participate in this. But it's not their project, you know. So we're missing a stage where we have to decide, where the decision making has to be from the very beginning.
And it's great from our point of view.
Yeah. Otherwise, you know, without participation or learning how to participate, we end up, you know, with a political system that could lead to, you know, sheep being led. So what we need to do is, you know, is constantly have a call for action. So advocacy is a key word. It's a key word for this summer institution. And we have to help children to learn to be advocates and to be responsible for their advocacy, but they can't do it on their own. They need to be supported by adults. And when the world doesn't listen, we just have to pump up the volume sometimes, okay? So I want to finish on, I'm on time.
Yeah.
So I want to finish on a poem that was written in our last year, in 2018, in the event I was talking to you about. This was written by 9 and 10-year-olds, and they presented this in the closing session of this. If you imagine we've been together 7 days, they presented this in the program was called at that time Cats. So the under 10s were called kittens, and the kittens got together as a group with the help of some adults, and they decided to write a poem. And they wrote what is called a reverse poem, and this is the poem that they wrote. They said, "We must not listen to children. You are wrong if you think that children are worth something. I know that children don't have ideas. It's not true that children are intelligent. Children can't help adults. Don't think that children can change the world. By listening to us, by loving us, by encouraging us, we will get nowhere. It's useless. Hitting us, ignoring us, that's the most important thing. Listen to us, unless you reverse the thinking. And listen to us, that's the most important thing. Ignoring us, hitting us, it's useless. We will get nowhere. By encouraging us, by loving us, by listening to us, children can change the world. Don't think, that children can't help adults. Children are intelligent. It's not true that children don't have ideas. I know that children are worth something. You are wrong if you think that we must not listen to children." So, so this was a group of 9 and 10-year-olds, and they designed this poem as a conclusion. So, so that's basically my. I think I've got another one. Oh no, that's whoops. Oh, sorry about that. So that's more or less the introduction I wanted to give.
Jonathan, what I wanted to ask you, if it's possible, to share this PowerPoint with me, and
Yes.
I will put it on Canvas.
Yeah, you
so
can have it.
each of you will have it.
Thank you.
Yeah? Okay.
So I've got just a few minutes left, but this afternoon we'll be working together anyway on these. So what I want to do, if it's okay, is we'll do an interactive in groups activity working on participation and provision and protection to kind of design something. I won't spoil the surprise now, of how we're going to do that, but we'll put this into practice. But please, if you have any comments or any reaction, yes.
So how can we bring this 7-day residential experience to British Columbia? I know that, for example, the Human Early Learning Partnership here would be very interested.
You'd be interested?
Yeah.
Well, we would like to do this on a continental basis, so we're experimenting. I'm going back to India in September, but we want to develop something in North America, and we want to do something in Africa. So yes, we want to do something in North America. Whether it should be in Canada or the US, I'm not sure right now.
But we have Dr. Charles Worth here, who is accidentally a representative for children and youth for British Columbia. So, Jennifer, what do you think?
Well, and I'm also thinking about Human Early Learning Partnership and some of the great allies that are in British Columbia. So, yeah, convening, gathering, kind of synergy.
I
British
was
Columbia is
actually
probably the most
thinking,
progressive in Canada right now.
yeah. I was thinking the same way, that doing it in North America and definitely not in the United States again. But
I can feel the harmony between these two countries.
But British Columbia could be a great place, and let's consider it one of the consequences of this summer institute, right?
Would you be happy with that? Would you like to engage with that? Because it's not like me coming and doing it. It would be,
No.
I can guide it, but it's building a team of people that could
I think
come together.
this group would be the pioneering group, and we'll have many more, right?
And we are right on the border of the US
Yes.
too, so it's kind of like a
Yeah.
It's a bit of a walk from Tennessee and places like that, though, yeah?
Well, Georgia, Alabama, and others, no. Yeah, I think it might be great, Jane, yeah.
Does giving children the vote ever come up in your sessions to the children?
It's something that we've discussed quite a lot, you know, and I was born in Britain, so Brexit is always a subject, and you know, it's true that if children, or at least 16-year-olds, have the right to vote in that context, you know, Britain wouldn't be in the mess it is today, you know. So, but it's true that there are many instances where children say that, you know, we don't have a right to vote, and your neighbour next door, the US, you can see that what happens when children get frustrated with politics, with the gun laws and poverty and other things, they raise up and they become advocates. But yeah, that is a big issue.
It just seems to me it's the logical consequence of so much of what we're talking. It would turn everything on its head in a really good way.
Yeah. But then there is a question of knowledge and understanding, and again it comes down to critical thinking, because not being pulled into lies and looking behind what those arguments are. And children need help with that, I think, to make decisions on their own.
Okay, if
Yes.
you don't have questions, let's take 5 minutes before Dr. Charles Worth will start her presentation, and we'll go on with the day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just wanted to last thing, and to say to, what's your name? Amida. You showed that book there. I went for the walk on this wonderful campus, and I went to the bookshop, and I bought this little book, which is The History of Childhood. It's one of these short introduction things, which is very ambitious to talk about worldwide history of childhood. It's something I teach, and Korczak's not mentioned at all. Eglantine Jebb is mentioned quite a few times, but Korczak is not mentioned.
Korczak is not.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things we need to do to make the story proper.
So let me start by saying thank you for the invitation. Jerry is also very persuasive. So we've had some opportunities, our office and the Janusz Korczak Association, to do a number of things together. So I'm very appreciative of that. And as a way of beginning too, I just want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, particularly the Musqueam in this location where we are. And it's always important for me to remember on whose land I am walking. And British Columbia, there are 203 First Nations, and you'll hear as I talk about British Columbia that really changes the way in which we have to show up as representatives and as advocates for children and youth. But by reminding myself and each other about the land on whose land we're walking on, it's a reminder that on this land there have been many, 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 many generations of Indigenous peoples doing their work, raising and loving their children, and bringing culture and tradition into the ways in which children are embraced. So good to remember that we have some important things to look back on in history, both from the point of view of all the good and also the evil that can be wrought upon children. So, there we go. I want to just start with framing a little bit about who I am. This was my undergrad graduation photograph from 1981 when I graduated in the School of Child and Youth Care. So, a couple of things. One is, anything you notice about that group? Pardon me? Women and white, yes. So there are so many things that in the course of my 42-year journey in the field of child and youth care that I have actually had to unlearn. There are also a few things that I've had to relearn. So when I started in the School of Child and Youth Care at University of Victoria back in the 70s, I was introduced to two really important concepts. One, and there were two, there was a book called The Other 23 Hours that I read, and there was also an introduction to Janusz Korczak's teachings that was given by Dr. Jim Anglin at the time. We actually didn't have a text, so I'm thinking that much of what's been created has been translated since then. But Jim, for some reason, knew the story and translated that. So there are two things. The Other 23 Hours, back then, when children were struggling, they were put into institutional environments. They were emotionally disturbed, and they were taken from their families and communities and put into institutional environments. So we'll come back to that in a moment, but the idea of the other 23 hours was the belief or the sense that there was 1 hour a day in which clinical treatment would be done, largely by a psychologist or psychiatrist. But in these institutional environments, the other 23 hours were what people like me did. That's where we built relationships, where we created normative developmental experiences, where we were trying to love and nurture a child. So that was a very powerful way to begin to think about the work that I was doing, was that it was fundamentally about relationship, respect, and love. And then you bring that in with Korczak's teachings about respect and rights and honoring and child's voice, and it was pretty mind-blowing given where we were at as an institution, as a system of care. Because when you think about that time, it doesn't look like anybody's from that time, but we were still, yeah, it was behavioral. It was about a token economy. You know, it was like, okay, you do this as I say it, then you get this little reward. So we were treating them like pigeons and rats. You know, so to have, and that was the context within which we were working, so to be able to have my tuition, my teaching, talk about a fundamentally different way of interacting with children to bring about their well-being was, as I say, very mind-blowing and very progressive at the time. So that's my origin story. So I was raised up in a good way by many amazing teachers, and so there was a lot of really good foundation, but there were also, as you can see from our whiteness and our gender disparity, we also have a number of things to unlearn or to relearn and to figure out how to do differently. So there we go. So one of the other things that became really clear very early on was this notion of the difference between quality and equity, because it was a lot about, as you think about that kind of time, it was very much about, we'll make things equal, or, it has to look a certain way, and there was a tremendous desire for uniformity. And so the shift in thinking was to think more about equity, and then also to recognize where we were standing and what we were needing to address in terms of the reality of child's experience. And if you think about this, Korczak talks a lot about the experience of Jewish children, the experience of children living in poverty. I think that the parallel in our situation in British Columbia is the Indigenous child. And then increasingly, given the growth in the number of refugee and immigrant children who have had tremendous trauma in their lives before they've come here, and in certain areas of British Columbia, it's very much about the racialized child as well. So those are a couple of things. So I've had, one of the things that happened, again, I'll kind of go back to the story. One of the things that happened for me in my work was that I realized pretty early on that those kind of institutional environments actually weren't working very well. We removed a child from their family. We created a very, institutional, rule-bound environment in which there was a tremendous disparity of power and the children had very little power. And then we plop them back into the context within which they'd come from, and it would be like, oh, they're not fixed, or the parents did it wrong because they didn't sustain the behavioral techniques that were being implemented. So that was a pretty significant thing to begin to think, well, that's not working, so now what? So then that began a process for me of saying, well, just a second, children are in families, so maybe we need to think about the family. And then I thought, over time I began to learn from many good teachers, but families are in communities, so if we aren't attending to the well-being of community, we actually can't support the well-being of child. So really beginning to understand what's the kind of systemic environment within which we create the conditions for children to be successful. And I've learned that a lot from young people themselves. We were together at this one. Learned that a lot from young people, from the people who love young people and care and are on the front lines, etc. So fast forward, I've had quite a varied career. Happy to talk with you offline about that. It made no sense in some ways until I had the opportunity to become the representative for children and youth, and now I look back and go, retrospective coherence. All those things I did, whether I was working in the early years, I was working in, the only area that I haven't worked in actually is youth justice. But every other area, mental health, addictions, early years, resource development, child protection, etc., I've worked in over time. So I had the opportunity to become the representative for children and youth 9 months ago, and I want to acknowledge my two amazing colleagues, Michelle and Bronwyn. These are actually experts in two areas that I'm going to talk about, so I may have to shut up and invite other comments in. But our office is a group of about 70 people, and I have the tremendous privilege of leading this group and being representative, which is an independent officer of the Legislative Assembly in the province of British Columbia, which means I'm similar to the Ombudsperson, the Auditor General, Privacy Commissioner, and this in British Columbia, Police Complaints Commissioner, Ethics Commissioner, etc. So that's an independent office of the legislature. So how did we start? I think it's important to understand that we started out of trauma, out of a horrific case that led to a review done by the Honourable Ted Hughes, which the Korczak Association honoured several weeks ago. Honourable Hughes and his wife Helen Hughes were honoured. But he recommended that an independent office be created in order to, and I love this, assist, encourage, and sometimes prod the government to be more aware and responsive to the individual concerns of children, families, and youth. And to go from that, and I love this notion of assisting and encouraging, remember that, because there are many different ways in which we can have influence, any one of us. And said he recognized that. He recognized that there are different ways that we might have, bring about changes. And then he also said, and to recommend changes, to bring about the kinds of things that will address the systemic issues that we're seeing or the recurring issues that we're seeing for children and youth. What's important is the way in which the office has evolved since 2006 is that we are, and I feel very strongly about this, as being a rights-based organization. So we're very much guided by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And that, and you know these rights, they're often aspirational, they're often hard to pin down, but it's so important that we have frameworks like that that can hold us accountable and that we can refer back to in order to understand how we might do our work. So I want to share a little bit about what we do and try and connect it to this whole notion of what are the different mechanisms we have in which we can elevate and honor and respect children's rights. And you've heard I love the story that you've told in the Walking the Talk. So it's really important for us to think about, so how do we walk the talk as an organization that could stay kind of high in the levels? So our purpose is to be an independent advocate and an oversight body. So we work, as you'll see in a few moments, we work at the individual level and the systemic level, and we hold those two sometimes in tension, sometimes in collaboration. And we have to fundamentally champion the rights of and well-being of the children and youth that are in the province of British Columbia. And particularly for those youth who are most vulnerable, those youth who are incarcerated in justice and youth justice, voluntarily detained in mental health institutions, in the child protection system, and in high conflict environments. So that's what we are. And for me, this is a photograph that I just love. So this is of a friend, this is Bradley Dick, who's an amazing Indigenous leader from the Kwungan speaking territories, Songhees. This is his granddaughter. She is 4, which is amazing. She's an incredible singer and drummer. And she is singing and drumming at an elders gathering. And I put that up because it's so important to remember what we're trying to bring to life. And when you take a look at Bradley he calls her little granny because she's a wise soul. And when he's looking at little granny, he's just got that beautiful love in his eyes and his spirit. And she knows that. So here she is, she's at an elders gathering and she's sharing her song and her drumming. And honestly, there's not a dry eye in the house. Even recalling it, I get emotional.
And he sits low.
And he sits low and he's letting her do it. He's not saying, okay, you accompany me. He is going, you can do it, little granny. It's just beautiful. And I use that because it's just such a good reminder to me of what we're trying to create. Like, it's one thing to say we're a rights-based organization and we advocate and whatnot, but it's also important for us, I think, to have in mind what we're trying to bring to life for the well-being of our children. And as an Indigenous child, there are a lot of things that happen to many of the Indigenous children in this province. So if we remember that there's so much more that we can bring to life and aspire to. So that's Bradley. So from my perspective, it's important that as a representative, so obviously I am not working alone. Not only do we have 70 staff, but there are thousands of people that want us to be successful. Organizations like HELP, probably others here. But fundamentally we have the privilege really of representing the best interests of children going forward in their lives, and we want them to have good life outcomes. It's also really important to me, and I wanted to emphasize this, that we have to also create workplaces. So how many of you are in situations where you're supervising or you're kind of guiding organizations? Anybody? Okay. How many of you are working on teams or in workplaces? A few of you. Okay. It makes a difference the kind of environment that we create within which we can do our work. We can't be great rights-based advocates unless we're also in environments where we feel like our voices are being honored, etc. So that's another thing that's important for me to bring to life is what's the kind of environment that allows us to do our best work on children and youth. And the other thing that's important for me is to remain curious. There's actually so many things that's so complex. I don't know, even after 42 years and tons of wonderful people that provide advice and counsel, I don't know the answers on a lot of these complex issues that we're dealing with. So we have to continually ask ourselves, what do we want to create for children and youth? How do we create more Bradley and little grandmas grannies situations. What are the kinds of things that we want our children to be prepared for in the world? How do we honor and respect and prepare them? And the poem that you spoke to is a beautiful encapsulation of that. And so how do we, I should change this to the 3 Ps, how do we support participation? How do we protect? How do we uphold their voices going forward? So that's a little bit. Now, just to describe us so that you have a sense of this, and then I'll pull out a couple of stories as well. So we have a legal mandate. We're created by statute, the Representative for Children and Youth Act. And I should say that, are all of you from BC? Anybody from elsewhere? All BC? Okay. So nobody from Ontario. Good. So across the country, we were moving quite well towards having an advocate's office in almost every province and territory. The only outliers was PEI in Northwest Territories. They don't have a child advocate or an office that is responsible for child advocacy. PEI came on board and they now have a child advocate, and then the Doug Ford government eliminated the Ontario office, which was from my view catastrophic, because they were serving a significant number of children, thousands and thousands of children, and they were actually the poster child in this country on youth engagement and youth participation. So it's tragic. That was another thing that was honored by the Korczak Association, was Erwin Ellman, who was the first and so far the only advocate in the province of Ontario. So, like others across the country, we're created by statute, and so we have 3 primary aims that we have to fulfill. Advocacy, so that, and I'll talk some more about each of these, but I'll just give you the overview first. Advocacy, we have the opportunity to advocate with and for young people, children and youth, and that's Bronwyn's area of expertise as a manager of advocacy within our organization. So individual advocacy, a child or a young person can contact us, or somebody who cares about that child and knows the situation can reach out to us, and we can provide support if they are or should be receiving services primarily from Ministry of Children and Family Development in this province, but also some other areas of service, and assist them in navigating the tricky terrain of service delivery in this province. The other part about advocacy that we're trying to develop and build up is, as you can appreciate, when you have thousands of advocacy calls and you hear thousands of stories, that's a rich pool of data. So what we're trying to do is figure out the different ways that we can harvest out those patterns and themes that say, this is a recurring issue. Children are experiencing this, and that's not supportive of where they need to go and what's important for them. This area of the province is problematic. It keeps having the same kinds of issues. So we're trying to harvest those patterns and themes so that we can choose ways, we can discern ways to be influential and as Ted says, assist and encourage the government to move forward, as well as prod. So advocacy is an important body. That's, if you will, that's our forward face. That's the way in which we are connected out into community primarily, and I have information for you to take away. The other group is critical injuries and deaths, and Michelle, a colleague, is part of that team. And imagine this, that we, a child in this province who's receiving some services, something very significant happens to them. They've been sexually assaulted, they've self-harmed, they've been beaten, something along those lines. So and that happens a lot. So every month we receive critical injury reports. So these reports come to us primarily from Ministry of Children and Family Development staff. And then Michelle's team takes a look at those. They've been rising. There's probably 240 to 250 seems to be the monthly average of those reports coming in. And the team reviews those, looks into the history or the background, the initial background of this, and then brings forward a number of them that are within our legislative mandate, typically 100, 120, that we review as a full executive team to see what needs to be done here. Because again, those critical injuries can teach us something. They can say, we're seeing an increase in the number of children with this kind of experience in their life, or we're seeing this particular thing that's happening over and over again in this kind of a resource. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We're seeing an increasing number of children who are trans, gender non-binary, gender fluid. That it's not a huge number, but it's an increasing number. It's a significant number. But what's interesting is if you compare them against the other children that we might learn about with critical injuries or deaths, the primary critical injury that they're experiencing is self-harming and suicide attempts or suicide completions. So that says something to us. It's like, okay, now you go into then you've got a little bit of a clue, right? Then you say, well, what might be going on? What else could we learn? And what we can learn if we go into the literature, we begin to ask the people that really know a lot about this, is that actually would be expected because of the way in which society often responds to these children and how we deny them their sense of identity or the emergence of their identity going forward. So when we think about the connection back to rights and about listening and respecting children, the fact that we aren't respecting child's right to form an identity, and denying them that right in many cases, or doing other harmful things, that escalates the risk factors that they experience. So that's important for us to pay attention to. Another group of young people that we're seeing all too often is Indigenous girls between the ages of 15 and 18. And how many of you do any of you work with Indigenous populations? Whereabouts do you work?
I work for the Richer Initiative Social Pediatrics Program in the downtown east side.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So you probably have a lot to add to this discussion as well. Anybody else that works with Indigenous young people? Okay. So see if this fits with your experience. So what we're seeing is young women who have had, typically there's intergenerational and historical trauma. So lots of things have happened within their families, a lot of things that have gone on, generations past and also within their immediate environment. We're seeing that there are significant mental health or substance use issues that either they are experiencing, the people that are immediately around them are experiencing, sexual exploitation, sexual violence, multiple placements. They've been brought into care and they've bounced around a lot, and they haven't had that kind of stability that I think every child needs to have. It kind of gets to the protective piece. And what ends up happening is really bad things happen to those children. And missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls reports really speaks to a lot of that as well. But here's the thing. When we look back on the stories of those young people, there's two things that we're noticing. One is that for many of them, we knew when they were much younger that things weren't going well, and we didn't act in a fulsome way in order to create the environment in which they could be successful, and their families could be successful, and their communities could be successful. We're also seeing that for many of them, the narrative in our service delivery system has been that, well, they're resistant, they're non-compliant. And my reaction to that is, frankly, bullshit. Come on, if they're saying, I don't want what you have on offer, we obviously aren't offering what they need. And we're not asking them. So when we get back to that notion of the child's voice and the child's rights, this is such a critical thing. When we see stuff happening, then we need to figure out how might we learn more from the lived expertise that young person has about their situation and what they need. So those are a couple of examples of what we see when we begin to take a look at the critical injuries. The other thing that happens for us is we're looking for those themes and patterns, but we're also saying, what can we do right now? Does this young person need an advocate? We can assign an advocate. Does this person, do we need to get involved in some way and raise it as a case of concern with government and say, you know, we're really worried about this young person. Can you please follow up and report back to us? Is this something that we want to perhaps, through the advocacy, start to convene a bigger conversation? So there's a number of things available to us when we start to look at what's going on with our critical injuries and deaths. And the third area that we're responsible for is monitoring and research. So there's a couple of ways we can monitor things like, you know, we're seeing what's happening in advocacy in the CID area. It's like, okay, well, maybe we should do some more research in that. So an area that we're doing research in right now is fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. And in FASD, we see many of the young people that are really struggling have often a very late diagnosis in FASD or suspected, but because there's so much shame and stigma associated with it, in young, yeah.
What's the acronym stand for?
Sorry, fetal alcohol syndrome disorder.
Spectrum
Yeah.
disorder. Thank you.
And
Spectrum
Alicia, you
disorder.
had a question, yeah, I saw that hand. Yeah?
Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the 120 children.
Yeah.
Is that children that are in the child welfare system, or is that children in the general population?
Great, thank you for clarifying. It's children who are receiving services that we have under our Act, reviewable services. And so these children would be, many are in care, many are receiving services, and they might be in care by agreement, or they might be in care through the courts, through temporary custody or continuing custody, or they might be receiving services from one aspect of government. So it's interesting because that means there are lots and lots of kids that we don't hear about that would also be very interesting. And in fact, our mandate, the health authorities are supposed to submit these reports as well. So we would be getting things from emergency or adolescent psychiatric units, et cetera. And we haven't been successful in convincing the health authorities to comply as yet. We're working on that. So yeah, you're right. It's actually quite a narrow population.
It's pretty high.
Yeah.
It should be.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it does include mental health services. So a child might live at home,
Yes.
but be receiving a mental health service.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And then if they were self-harmed.
Yeah. Yeah. So if they're receiving a service, then. So yes, it does seem alarming, but it's an interesting thing. So the numbers have been going up, and just as an aside, I think, well, the fact that the numbers are going up isn't an indication that there are more injuries happening. It's an indication that people are getting better at reporting. And frankly, I think it's so important that we gather this information, that we understand what's happening to the most vulnerable kids, because the more that we understand about high vulnerability, the more that we can actually begin to reverse engineer the systems of care and the systems of support, including the education system, to support all children. So yesterday I was meeting with the Minister of Education, and the Ministry of Education has been fantastic. It's the poster child of a ministry to work with, to be honest, because they have responded so well to recommendations that we have put forward, and they are actively engaged in addressing the experience of children and youth who are in care within the education system and Indigenous children. So we're seeing, and you'll see a little bit later, we're seeing some dramatic improvements in some of the school districts because they're just all in to try and figure out how to support the kids who are most vulnerable. Because they get, if they create, it's like the safe and sound. If you create a safe environment for the kids who are most vulnerable, it's a sound world for all. So same thing, if you create safe environments for kids in schools, then you can create a sound environment for all children and all those that are interacting with the education system. Any other questions? Okay. So our third area, again, monitoring. So taking a look at things like fetal alcohol spectrum, and we've been doing that in a way because we see that as a consideration. And when we started to take a look at the data, it's like there's $5.2 million in this province spent on FASD. It's $81.8 million spent in autism. Now, how many of you work with young people in autism spectrum? Okay. So we know that it's not sufficient the way that it is right now. So not pitting one against the other, one diagnosis against the other, or one area of concern. But if we know that autism is not getting, that young people with autism are not getting the support they need, how in heck is 5 million going to go far enough in a province this fast? And when you start to think about who are most affected, it's primarily Indigenous children, not solely by any stretch of the imagination, but it's really important to think, well, what's our accountability here? We really need to understand this. And again, how do we address it from the point of view of the shame and the stigma, but most important, privilege the child's voice in this. So we are spending time walking alongside young people in their day-to-day life to understand what's it like to be in your skin. And what are some of the things that give you joy, that create positivity, that help you learn? What are some of the things that are taking away from that? And how can we amplify those things that are going to be important? So monitoring does those kinds of things. They're taking also a look at children aging into adulthood. And they also, because we issue recommendations, they monitor the implementation of recommendations, so we know something's happening. Want to note a couple of things. One is that this is nested in a bubble of Indigenous strategies. 60% of the young people in care receiving services are Indigenous children, and there's lots of reasons that that's happened to young people. There's, as we like to say now, it's not that there's an over-representation of Indigenous people in the child welfare system. It's that the child welfare system is over-involved in the lives of Indigenous people. So we have to really reimagine how that looks. So we're trying to do that ourselves. And then the other thing that's so important, which really speaks to the work that Jonathan was talking about, is engagement of youth and community. So children and youth's voices and their community's voices, people who know them. What are they saying? What do we need to pay attention to? So that's who we are. But here's something about, our ways of being, our ways of walking in our work. And hopefully this is useful to you as you think about translating it into your different contexts. So youth and community engagement is a way of being. It's a way of walking in the world. So, and it's got its roots in social movements. Jonathan talked about Gandhi. That's a social movement. People who've been involved in the disability sector, that was a movement to deinstitutionalize, a movement to bring, to create a community around folks. So the fundamental issue here is nothing about us without us. So that's a way of walking. It's easier said than done, right? Because our systems are so oriented towards having the answer and linearity, etc. And so to bring in a youth perspective or a child's perspective sometimes upsets the apple cart. So easier said than done, but it's an important way of being. Come on. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So this is actually a beautiful piece of work that can be downloaded off of the internet. The Children's Aid Foundation of Canada did a piece on youth engagement that I often read things about youth engagement that are actually not written by youth. So this was actually done through youth coming together and saying, this is what matters, this is what makes a difference to us. So that's the notion of youth engagement, and something that we have to be mindful of is how is it that we participate and keep learning and keep measuring how successful we are in going forward. And they talk about it being meaningful, ethical, and sustainable. So meaningful and sustainable is not about having a gathering, getting youth input and saying, thank you very much, I'm going to leave now, right? It's not sustainable and it's not meaningful. Ethical is not about asking a young person with lived expertise to tell their story in front of a bunch of adults. And the more emotional story, the better, which I often see as well. That is not youth engagement because it's not ethical to put put a young person in a situation in which they could be re-traumatized by that experience, unless that's something that they have said very clearly and with a lot of support and understanding of what the impact might be, that they are saying, no, I want to do this is important, and it's my choice. So those are important things to think about as we go forward. It's just a gathering. This was a gathering of youth advisors from around the province, and this is one incredible young spokesperson, Bryant. And it was very interesting because, like you were talking about, there were a few adults that spoke, but by and large, just a few. I think I was given 15 minutes in a full day, and the minister was given 15 minutes in a full day, and that was basically it, to try and set this, to say, here's who we are, and we really wish to understand, but the rest of the time was entirely designed and delivered by the young people themselves, including their poetry, their music, their storytelling, their dancing, etc., and all the richness and the beauty of these young people. So a second way of being is cultural safety. So this is something that when you take a look at the experience of Indigenous folks in this province, but certainly anywhere in the colonized world, and I'll actually use this opportunity to read an excerpt from Korczak, which I just thought was, if I can find my glasses, that is. Let me just set the stage for you here. So he said, "We plunder mountains, cut down trees, exterminate animals. Communities proliferate where once there were forests and swamps. We continually settle people in new territories. We have subdued the world, put iron and animals to our use, subjugated the colored races, coarsened relations among nations, and placated the masses. A righteous order is still a long way off, while injury and misery grow." And as I read that, I thought, he's speaking about colonization of the lands, the colonization of the peoples. So when we think about the impact of colonization, we have to understand that there's reconciliation and there's restoration and reparations, and we have to figure out how we're going to walk in the world in a better way and bring a cultural humility forward. So a way of being is to think about cultural safety. And this was a graphic, happy to share it with you if anybody's interested. This was a graphic that was created, a number of us called in a circle on cultural safety. We worked for a couple of years together to try and figure out how do we own our responsibility, particularly as settlers, to create a culturally safer environment. So we're doing that internally, but we're also trying to stimulate that beyond. And one of the things to understand is when people are colonized, and children have been colonized as well, get back to the institutions that we used to put kids in. That's a colonizing response to children who are vulnerable. When people have been colonized, they lose their voice, or their voice is stolen from them. So that's one of the most important things to think about, is where is voice, where is the hearing, where is the ethic that we bring into our work. And basically, what we heard over and over again, the long piece of work that we did, was being culturally safe feels like being respected, understood, honored, cared for, valued for who you are, included, and in a safe place to share. And when people feel unsafe, what you see is the data is unequivocal. You see health outcomes worsen, you see life outcomes worsen, school participation goes down, attachment is damaged, people get physically sick, emotionally sick. So when people don't feel safe and don't feel like those things, respected, understood, honored, etc., then there are significant physical, emotional, and social damage caused. So it's really important that we figure out how to walk the talk. Any questions so far?
Jennifer?
Yeah.
Is it okay okay if I share
Absolutely.
your PowerPoint with the group? So you need to sign, each of you who hasn't, on Canvas, except Canvas, and I'll place it there, so you'll have access.
Great. So let me just take a pause because we're kind of coming into another part. Let me get a better sense of like, where are you from? So I get it. You're involved in the social pediatric movement, and then I know a couple of you. Where else? So let's just kind of go around. Where are you? Let's start with you, Judith.
My name is Judith, and my background is completely different. I'm from education or PG, computer science and business. And my interest is mostly Holocaust and anti-Semitism and children in the Holocaust.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Alicia.
Hi, Alicia, and I'm a doctoral student here at EBC in the School of Nursing.
Oh, okay.
And I'm working with Richard and Ray Cam, and we'll be researching the Circle of the Child.
Nice. Okay, that's great. And so with your background in the healthcare system, you'll really understand this deeply as well. Okay, let's go to you.
I'm a secondary school teacher in Richmond, and I'm also a master's student here.
Awesome. Okay. And so that's good. That'll be interesting to have some chat with you on the role of the schools in all of this. Sabrina.
I'm with Society for Children and Youth for BC.
Oh, nice. Okay,
Yes.
we have a good partnership. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Great. Of course, I'm assuming you know everybody. Okay, great. So it's just for my benefit now. Jenny.
I spent most of my life working in theater, often working with children and creating projects with children. I'm actually here because my grandparents were colleagues of Korczak. I know, and I wanted to learn more about his writings and what we are studying, which is the impact in the world.
Yeah. Wow. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you introduced yourself. Do you pronounce it Clea?
It's Clea. I'm a family nurse practitioner in the Richard Initiative Social Pediatrics Program.
Okay. Cool.
So my name is Alice. I'm a daycare teacher. Work with children aged 3 to 5 in Richmond, and also I'm also a master's student in BC.
Fantastic. Oh, great. Good range of ages that we're looking at here.
And I'm Amida. I'm a high school teacher and the guidance counselor in a Francophone school board in Vancouver.
Okay, good. Thank you. And
I am Anton Grunfeld. I'm an emergency physician. I'm a member of the Korczak Association of Canada.
Lovely. Nice to meet you. Great. Well, thank you for that, giving me a bit of a sense of who's in the circle here. So, being able to walk the talk in any of the areas that we're involved in, I think this is an important calling for us to think about cultural safety. And when you think about it, the notion of cultural safety, we focus very much on indigeneity, but cultural safety is an experience that people could have, and you've got in Richmond, you've got a very significant population of South Asian, and so you have to think about, so what's it like? Where do they see themselves? How is it that their traditions and practices and whatnot are being honored? How is the school constructed to ensure that they have voice and also understand the context within which they come from? So the notion of cultural safety is not just about indigeneity. Okay. So the other thing about this is it's not a checklist. It's not just like, oh, well, yeah, we've done this and therefore we are a culturally safe organization. I do see that. And the important thing is, and this also relates to the experience of the child, is we can never say that we have created a culturally safe space or that we have created a space in which young people are ethically engaged. It's always their right to tell us whether they feel that or not. It's their experience, not us thinking, oh, well, we've done this and this, therefore we are this. So, and for us, we work with this model of cultural safety. So cultural awareness is the head. Let's understand the story in the background. And I'm even thinking, within the Francophone community too, there's you know, the interests of young people and their families when they feel perhaps less included in society or less valued for their Francophone roots? And how is it that we, as practitioners that might not be connected to that community, how do we need to educate ourselves? What's the headwork that we need to do to understand the child's experience? Understanding, which is the heart stuff, beginning to really build the empathy. Humility, which is recognizing that we have a responsibility and that we have some complicity in maintaining certain systems the way that they are. And then over that, as we move through that, we can become more agile and responsive. So, I'm just going to skip over that. Yes, here we go. How do we affect change? So I think for any of us that are involved either in individual or systemic advocacy, we need to think about where are the different ways in which we might be able to affect change. So one thing is to think about where are kids attached or connected, or who's responsible for delivering services. So beginning to think, well, it's not just about the obvious ones, the Ministry of Children and Family Development or the Ministry of Education. It's also about thinking about the impact of poverty, so poverty reduction. It's also about thinking about the impact of healthcare and access to healthcare, right to a physician, for example. But it's also thinking about how do we hold up our families and the caregivers, and how do we support the children and youth so that they clearly have a voice as well. And what are those other community organizations, some of which you were involved in here, as community partners? Okay, so there are a few areas that we have to think about. So if we're going to affect change, what are some of the, here we go, what are some of the places that we might affect change? The other thing is, what are some of the systems within which we might affect change? We can work individually with a child, and that's a very important and legitimate way of bringing about change, of being able to advocate or support that young person as they get what they need. But we can also think about the broader service delivery system. And what are some of the things that we need to be impactful around in terms of our broader systems of care? So for example, if we're seeing that children and youth in the education system, if we were seeing that graduation rates is going down for a certain population of young people, would that not say to us, we have to take a look at what's happening and see if there's public policy or funding or clinical practices or whatever that needs to change in order to support those children going forward? So what are the service delivery systems? So when I think of in the early years, for example, that you're involved in, Alice, you know, the kinds of things that are systemic changes there, it's changing dramatically. On the one hand, you've got we're on the verge of universal childcare, so that will change the dynamics for families that have been struggling to provide good care, good quality care. And then that is a public policy decision that can change a lot for a child and family. So when we start to see the evidence in support of certain public policies, then that's an area that we can affect change. Funding, public policy, clinical practice, etc. But the other thing that often we forget about, because we speak to one another, sometimes we are not mindful of the importance of also thinking about how we bring about change in public sentiment. How many of you take a look online news? You know, yeah? And do you go to the comments section? It's interesting and appalling at the same time. So if there's an article on, I don't know, UN or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that was heartbreaking. So this report comes out, it's heartbreaking, and then you go down in the comment section and you see all sorts of really, really derogatory, negative, harmful attitudes being expressed in these kinds of things. That says to me that we have some important work to do in the broader public discourse as well. And really understanding that our work, it gets to the safe and sound, you know. If we aren't also thinking about the way in which we change public minds or attitudes, or inform or help people understand, not just to judge, but to say, well, where might that be coming from? Like, what's given rise to that? And what is it that we might need to offer? I think about the way in which certain populations are stigmatized, the way in which certain children are judged, like these young women is being judged as non-compliant or unresponsive to the offers of care. It's like, okay, well that, that comes from our service delivery system, but it's reinforced often within our broader public narrative as well. So it's important to think, like, where can we affect change? And what is the most important area that we might want to work on in a particular situation? Okay, let's try this. There. Okay, so for us, many are the ways that we could do that, and we've all got different ways in which you can affect change. So beginning to identify and discern what are those different ways that you can use your voice, or you can support young people in their voice in order to affect change. And I think I'll just end on this one, and then we'll open up for some discussion and some stories. But where do we need to focus our attention is always an important question. In any one of your areas of practice, I'm sure you could say, there's this, and that. There's like 15 things that you would like to see changed. So one of our responsibilities as advocates is to say, so where do we think we can effect some change within the spheres of influence that we individually have or collectively have? So where do we need to focus our attention, and how do we discern that? From my view, I think what's really important is that we listen to people who really understand. So this is Cindy Blackstock. How many of you know Cindy Blackstock? Okay, if you don't know her, please look her up. So Cindy Blackstock is the Executive Director of the Caring for First Nations Children's Society of Canada. And she has been she's a good scan woman from British Columbia. She worked in British Columbia. She's now in Ottawa. And she has been a tireless advocate. In fact, she's the recipient of one of the Korczak Awards, right? From several years back. Yes, yes. This is an extraordinary advocate that we need to learn from. And if you go on their website, you can actually sign up to, I can't remember what the campaign's called, but she's very, very knowledgeable about social movements and campaigns and engaging people. She's also been a tireless advocate in the public policy domain, in that she raised the disparity of funding for Indigenous children between if you were living off reserve and you were living on reserve. And so she won. It was a horrific story, but after many years won in the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal the case, so that the federal government was required to ensure that there was appropriate equitable funding on and off reserve. Still trying to get that implemented. She keeps going back to force the government to try and get it implemented. But here's someone that not only is a tireless advocate, but she's a brilliant person at raising, and really listening into children's voices. So how do we discern? We listen to people that are really amazing advocates and who are very connected to the experience of children. And on her website, by the way, there's some really great stuff on youth engagement and children's voice. And she'll bring lots of stories about what she's heard from young people. The other thing about how do we discern is we listen into communities. So this is a community up in the Fraser Canyon area that I had the opportunity to meet with. And they were really attuned, and what was beautiful is they came from education, from health, from mental health, from Indigenous governance, from a wide array, early years, and they had a really good sense of what was happening in their communities. So we listen to community. That's a really important place to discern. And, and then we ask. So these are some examples. I ask whenever I go out into community, and I've done hundreds of those kinds of sessions, I ask two things. One is, what do you think our office needs to pay attention to? What do you see in the work that you do that's important to pay attention to? Tell us about that, because those are the early warning signs or significant signs. And I ask, what are you proud of, or what's made a difference? So I ask this of everybody. And youth are amazing at what they share with me. So these are some sticky notes, some from youth, some from adults, but they share with me the things that they think we should pay attention to and the things that they have made a difference in their lives if they're young people, or that they're proud of if they're service providers. And when you start to ask people, it's amazing the intelligence that you get. Then you can start to theme it and work with it and say, oh, okay, well, this is the time. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there. So first of all, any questions about what we do or why we do it? Okay. So the intention, I think, in sharing this was to give you an example of an organization that's taken a rights-based approach to try and advocate for child and youth well-being. A couple of things I want to say. One is that we are learning how to be most effective. So we've been in existence 12, almost 13 years. Yeah, almost 13 years. And we've had lots of, kind of iterations, and I'm the third representative. We've tried lots of different things. Some things have worked, some things haven't worked. So in the process of trying to be the best advocate you possibly can be, there is no perfect solution. And keep trying, keep learning, etc. So that's one thing. The other thing is that having a value core seems to make a huge difference as well. If you know why it is you're doing what you're doing and what it is you're being called to. That's why the photograph of Bradley and Little Granny is so important. Like, what are we trying to bring to life? And when I read, and I just recently read Betty Lifton's book, which I hadn't read before, so thank you for sharing that.
The Keynote Children, yeah.
Yes, and just the story and Korczak's own process of trying some things. I mean, the story of the first couple of nights in the camp, the first time, and how things went sideways, and how he brought that curiosity. It's like, okay, well, that didn't work, so then now what might work? I think that that's a really important consideration as well, of how is it that we might continue to learn about how to bring about the best environment, and how to have a strong value core, so that when things are going sideways, you have a place to, okay, well, what do I really know? I know that it's really important to bring, all the things that were in that poster. Love, respect, inclusion, participation, the right to be heard, those kinds of things. How is it that what I am doing is or is not fulfilling that kind of core of purpose and responsibility? And then the other thing I think that you might want to take away is that with when we create institutions or organizations such as ours to try and uphold a children's rights, then you can't do it alone. So all of those gatherings, the sticky notes, all those kinds of things, creating those allies and those relationships becomes so important as well. We couldn't do our investigations, even though we have significant power, if we didn't have relationships with people or build relationships in the course of trying to gather information. We certainly can't do our advocacy work without building those relationships and trying to find a way forward and putting the child at the center, even if we have disagreements about the services that we may provide. So those are a couple of things about the organization that might be takeaways for you, and hopefully that's helpful to kind of say, well, how does an organization adopt or implement children's rights? Now, we do refer to the UN Convention all the time. So when we do our reports, I've got some examples here. We refer to the significant articles. When we are speaking to groups and trying to bring about shifts in public awareness and whatnot, we talk about the UN Convention, the UN Declaration, etc. So it's really important to speak about child rights as well, in order to raise awareness. And this is a public awareness piece too, is that oftentimes people have quite a simplistic view of what child rights are, and don't really understand some of the origins. So when you talk about those clusters, that actually helps people understand the 3 Ps, I think. It's like, oh, well, yeah, it is important to provide. It is important to protect, and it is important. And then we can start to see that as a platform for participation, because a lot of folks really struggle and say, well, just because a child wants to have a later curfew doesn't mean we should always listen to them. Like, we do know best. We hear that a lot. And it's like, well, let's unpack that a little bit. Like, how could that child be heard in the conversation about curfew or, their ability to go and be with their friends or whatever? Let's unpack that. Let's figure out how that child might be able to have some agency and decisions in their lives. So those are a couple of things to think of. And when I think of the Society for Children and Youth that we're partnering with, we're taking a look at representation. So there are a lot of things that happen to kids over which they have no control. And what ends up happening is when significant decisions are being made, their voices become diminished. So one of the things we're doing with your organization is to try and take a look, how do we create more space for child's voice and child's right to be heard? So sometimes you have to be very, very practical and pragmatic going forward as well.